Okay, good evening. I'm Dr. Laura Tunerman, Director of the American Democracy Project here at Penn West, California. The American Democracy Project is a multi-campus initiative focused on higher education's role in preparing the next generation of informed, engaged citizens. And the namesake for this program, the Dr. Melanie Blumberg Post-Election Analysis Forum, was a professor of political science, a tireless advocate for civic engagement and voter participation, and a faculty member responsible for bringing ADP to campus. Under her direction, California was one of the first universities to pilot the American Democracy Project way back in 2003. When some of your students were so young, you wouldn't have been paying any attention. That year, Cal made the national news. There was a roll call article because more than 2,000 students registered to vote, and the turnout in the 4 borough precincts around the university quadrupled. So it was an amazing start. The university held its first election analysis forum just a week after that election, and the forum has become a biannual event that features nationally acclaimed political scientists and journalists. Before I hand the mic over for better people to tell you more, I do want to thank a few people. I want to thank the members of the American Democracy Project Board for their help and their support. I want to thank the Department of the History, Philosophy and Modern Language, the College of Arts and Humanities, at the College of Social Sciences and Human Services for their funding and support, as well as the Campus Vote Project for their support. I also want to remind you, those who are joining us by Zoom, that if you have questions and you put them in the Q&A, they will be shared with the panelists. For those of you who are in the room, you can just ask them on a mic yourself. I'm thrilled to see our audience here, and I'm going to hand the mic over to Dr. Bob Mihalik, who's the Assistant Dean of the College of Sciences, Social Sciences and Human Services, to formally welcome you to tonight's program.
Thank you, Dr. Tunerman. As Dr. Tunerman said, I'm Bob Mihalik, Associate Dean for the College of Social Sciences and Human Services here at Pennsylvania Western University. And on behalf of Penn West, I'd like to thank everyone in attendance here in the room and on Zoom and the webinar. As a friend of the late, great Dr. Melanie Blumberg, I'm honored to be here this evening, and I know how happy she would be to see how dedicated our students and faculty are to the American Democracy Project and this fantastic post-election analysis event. One last special thank you to Dr. Laura Tunerman for being an outstanding director of the American Democracy Project here at Penn West, California. Thank you. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce our moderator for this evening. He is the Money and Politics Editor at KDKA, Mr. John Delano.
Thank you very much, Dean. I don't think I need the mic. I think I'm wired. I'm wired. Dean, thank you very much. Dr. Laura, thank you very much again for having us back after 2 years, actually 4 years, because 2 years ago we did everything on Zoom. If you happen to have tuned in just a little bit ago to hear some of my colleagues who are on Zoom as participants, you probably thought this was the cold open for Saturday Night Live. I'm not a fan of these hybrid things. I'd rather have all the panelists right here in front of us, and you can watch it on Zoom, but it's a little awkward and it's a little tough as we try to do this. But we're going to see if we can make this work, because 3 of our 4 panelists are via Zoom. I think, is this the camera I'm supposed to look into? I think if I'm looking straight at the audience. But it's hard to do that when you all are right here. This is a most unusual post-election analysis forum. We don't know who won. Who is in charge of the U.S. House of Representatives? We think it's the Republicans, but we're not sure. The Senate, 50-50, 51-49. We won't know until Georgia votes on December 6th. And the same is true here in Pennsylvania, because we have a state House of Representatives that right now is hovering between Republican and Democratic control. It's down to 2 seats, one in Bucks County, one in Montgomery County, both of which are suburban Philadelphia. If the Republicans win both of those seats, they take the constitutional majority 102 to 101. If the Democrats win one of those seats, they will take the majority. We don't know who won. So this is going to be a very interesting discussion tonight to try to explain what happened when we don't know what happened. Well, we sort of know what happened. And the scholars who are part of this panel, the reason they're on the panel and they're so expert is they can tell us why we're in this confused morass today that no one really suspected. And that, to me, is another one of those many questions on my list that I'm going to ask, and I'm sure some of the folks will address this. Did the pundits get it all wrong? Were the pollsters all wrong? How did this happen that what was supposed to be a great red wave of Republican victories, how did that get stopped in its track? What went wrong for them? Or maybe what went right for the Democrats? I'm sure we're going to get some answers on that as well. So the way this is going to work is that tonight I'll introduce our four panelists and give them each an opportunity to talk. Now, my experience with our first panelist is that he loves to talk and he's got a lot of slides. So Alan, don't worry, I'm not going to cut you off. Well, maybe after 10 minutes I will. But Alan Abramovitz, who is our first speaker, is really quite the scholar, well recognized nationwide. It's a great honor to have him here. He is the, I'm going to get this right, the Alban W. Barkley Professor of Political Science at Emory University. Anybody know who Barkley was? Lou knows.
Truman's VP.
He was vice president under Harry S. Truman. Yes, indeed. And Alan is the author of a book called The Great Alignment, Race, Party Transformation, and the Rise of Donald Trump. And he is certainly recognized as one of our leading forecasters of presidential and congressional elections. We're going to start with Alan. I should have pointed out, though, because those of you who are veterans of this forum know that every forum, I ask for predictions. And I asked for predictions 2 years ago when we gathered via Zoom. And basically the two questions were, who is going to win the House? Who's going to win the Senate? And to the extent you can you give me, the numbers? What do you think it is? Predictions are right here. I'm not going to read them yet, but I will read them and we'll see whether our experts got it right or not. So with that little interlude, it's my great honor and pleasure to introduce one of the great political scientists and scholars here in the United States, Professor Dr. Alan Abramovitz. Alan, take it on. You're on.
Hey, thanks so much for that introduction, John. I hope everyone can hear me. I am just delighted to be participating in this election forum, and wish I could be there in person. I hope 2 years from now we'll be doing this again, and I will be there because I really miss being there, and that it's a wonderful place. So let me. I don't have too much time, as John told you, so I'm going to move pretty quickly. I'm going to share my slides with you. I don't have very many, actually, not as many as I usually have. So can you all see the slides there? I can't hear you, but I'm going to assume you can see my slides. In the brief time I have right now, I'm going to focus on one very, very interesting aspect of this midterm election, which is so interesting in so many ways. I'm going to talk about the U.S. Senate and how it came out, why it came out the way it did. So let me move on, if I can figure out how to do that. Now I'm trying to figure out how.
We see your intro slide. We're not seeing the next
I
one.
know. I'm trying to figure out how to go down. Here we go. Okay. So that's not what I wanted, though. Okay. So Yeah. So as I said, this was a very unusual midterm election in a number of ways. When we look at the results as far as we know them right now, Republicans appear to have gained fewer than 10 seats in the House of Representatives. That's one of the smallest seat gains for the out party in a midterm election in the last 70 years or so. There have been a couple where the out party actually gained a few seats, but this is a very disappointing showing, obviously, for Republicans. But they will likely have a very narrow majority, probably something on the order of 220 to 215, even a little smaller than the majority the Democrats have had for the last couple of years. At the same time, Democrats actually picked up a net gain of 2 governors. Actually, one took 3 Republican seats in Maryland, Massachusetts, and now we know in Arizona, that was just called recently. Republicans picked up 1 Democratic seat in Nevada. So a gain of 2, again, unusual for a midterm election. Democrats also flipped several state legislative chambers. I know Lou has been watching that closely, and he'll probably have, or he may have more to say about that. Again, unusual for a midterm election to see the out party gain state legislative chambers. Democrats also defeated a number of these Republican election deniers around the country who are running for governor and secretary of state. In fact, just about all of them lost in the swing states. But I want to talk about another thing that happened that I think in some ways may be the single most important result of this midterm election in terms of its implications for the next 2 years of American politics, certainly for the Biden presidency. And that is that the Democrats have kept control of the U.S. Senate. And as John said, they'll either have 50 seats or 51 seats, depending on the outcome of the runoff election in Georgia that will take place on December 6th. So how did they do this? There are a number of things I think that are important to understand here. First, you have to look at the Senate map, the 2022 Senate map. And when we look at that map, and you can see the states that had Senate elections this year, the Democrats started off in a fortunate position in that they only had 14 seats up. Republicans had 21 seats up, including a special election in Oklahoma. So there were 2 races in Oklahoma. So only 14 Democratic seats, and not only 14 Democratic seats, but not very many of those seats were in swing states, in states that were potentially vulnerable to a takeover by Republicans. So that's the first thing. The Republicans had more seats up, although they too actually didn't have that many that were in swing states. So it was clear that it wasn't going to be a big swing one way or the other. It was going to be likely a very small swing one way or the other in this election. Another thing that was fortunate for the Democrats, or at least something that they, I think, helped, that Chuck Schumer was certainly involved in bringing about, was that there were no Democratic retirements in potential swing states. Democrats had incumbents running in every one of those potential swing states in Arizona, Colorado, Georgia, Nevada, New Hampshire. The only Democratic retirement was in Vermont. Obviously, there was no risk of Republicans taking over Vermont. So that was an advantage the Democrats had. They had incumbents running. Incumbency is still an advantage. It's a smaller advantage than it used to be, but it's still worth something. There were 3 Republican retirements, however, in swing states: in Pennsylvania, North Carolina, and Ohio. If you want to call Ohio a swing state, it's kind of a borderline to call that a swing state. But that turned out to be very significant, as we know, because one of those vacancies, one of those open seats was in Pennsylvania. And the other thing that I think has gotten a lot of attention here in this election, and trying to understand what happened here, is the role that these so-called election deniers had in affecting the outcome of these elections in these swing states. And the question is, did the election deniers actually cost Republican Senate seats that they could and should have won? And so you see here 6 of these people, 6 of these candidates, Blake Masters on the top left in Arizona, Herschel Walker in Georgia, that's Adam Laxalt in Nevada, Don Bolduc in New Hampshire, J.D. Vance in Ohio, and of course, I know you all recognize Dr. Oz down there in the lower right. So 6 of these election deniers, and there's a 7th, and I want to talk about too, to look at the incumbent Ron Johnson in Wisconsin. So one thing when I look at this election is that this was a highly nationalized election, just as all elections recently have been. You could predict the Senate margin for Republican Senate margin with a high degree of accuracy based on the Republican presidential margin in 2020. You can see there the results. This is a regression analysis. You can see that each of those dots is a state with a Senate race. You can see that most of them are very close to the line, but some are a little above it, some are a little below it. So the presidential vote explains over 90% of the variance in the Senate margin 2 years later, over 90%. That's how nationalized this election was. However, what we want to know is there anything else that matters? The answer is yes, incumbency matters. In the regression analysis, when you add incumbency, you can see there it's worth almost 4 points. If you look under the B there, the unstandardized coefficient, 3.9, that's what you get from incumbency over and above what you get from the partisan makeup of your state. Okay, so incumbency is on average still worth something. So what about these Republican election deniers in these key swing states? You can predict the margin that they should have won or lost by based on the presidential vote and the incumbency status of the race. Look at the actual margin that they won or lost by and see what the difference is. Did they underperform or did they overperform? You can see that 6 of the 7 underperformed by varying margins. Only one, Adam Laxalt, actually overperformed. He actually did a little bit better than you would expect given the presidential results in Nevada and the fact that he was running against a Democratic incumbent. But otherwise, they all did a little bit did worse, some a little bit worse, some a lot worse. Mehmet Oz, right here, or here meaning where you are, in Pennsylvania, had actually underperformed the most, but losing by the election by 4.5 points. He should have won by 2.3 points, according to this analysis, given the presidential vote in Pennsylvania and the fact that it was an open seat. So he underperformed badly. Ron Johnson did too, but he still won. Pennsylvania was the only state where the outcome was reversed, where the outcome came out different, and according to this analysis, because of the fact that you had a candidate running who was an election denier and considered an extremist in other ways as well, and had other weaknesses too, of course. Okay, so it does matter, but it probably only resulted in at most maybe 1 seat moving to the Democrats. So I'm going to conclude this. I'd be glad to answer questions about this and talk a lot about other things later. Democrats are feeling good right now. You know, they've just held their own in the Senate, held on to the Senate, maybe will gain a seat. But if you look ahead to 2024 and look at that Senate map in 2024, it is just a very, very difficult map for Democrats. Because in 2024, there are going to be 21 Democratic seats up and only 10 Republican seats. So Democrats have a lot of seats to defend. You look at those Republican seats, there are not any obvious Democratic pickup opportunities there. None of them look very promising. Florida, at one time you would have said, well, Florida might be a possibility, but certainly based on what happened this year, doesn't look very likely. And then you look at the Democratic seats that they're going to be defending, and we don't know if incumbents will be running or not, but look at those seats. They've got to defend Montana. They've got to defend West Virginia. They've got to defend Ohio. And those are 3 states that voted for Trump by big margins. And then they've got to defend some swing states as well. Again, the other seat in Pennsylvania, Michigan, Wisconsin, Nevada, again. So this is going to be a very difficult election. Republicans are likely to just look at the map, not knowing whatever else is going on in 24. The map alone tells you that Republicans should be in a position, if they don't blow it, to gain several Senate seats in 2024. And I'll stop with that.
Alan, thank you very, very much. Appreciate it. You're always very insightful. I'm going to come back to you on the 2024 because we'll get you on the spot when we ask you to make your prediction, and we'll hold you to it when we meet again.
Okay, sure.
2 years. So, Alan, thank you very much. Our next speaker is another professor, Professor Amber Gaffney, who's a social psychologist whose research is focused on group processes, intergroup relations, and how people identify really and mobilize social change. She's an associate professor at Humboldt State University in California, and her work has been featured on National Public Radio along with the BBC. So, Amber, it's great to have you part of the panel. I think you joined us 2 years ago, and we're really happy to have you back. So take 5 and use the Abramowitz rule if you need to. Go 10 minutes. All yours, Amber.
Hi, thank you so much for having me. First, I don't have a PowerPoint presentation for you, so thanks for that, Alan. I now look underprepared. That's awesome. But I really appreciate being here, and like the rest of the panel, I would prefer to be in person, and I also know the trauma of teaching in this high flex environment, so I know what you're going through there. Like it's not the best. Yeah, so you said a little bit about my research. Where I hope to contribute to this panel is giving you some of the, psychological mechanisms behind voter decisions and behind why people choose to vote, to not vote. We can talk about stuff like insurrections and why people do that. I come at this from a bit of a different perspective than Ellen because I come from a psychological perspective. So yeah, I'm happy to answer questions about all of that. I think one of the big things for this election, and I mean, I'm always, I don't like to make, as you will find out when you ask me to make predictions, I don't like to make predictions about outcomes of elections because I'm a psychologist. That doesn't seem like what my job is to do. But I think one of the interesting things that Democrats should be excited about is the mobilization of women's votes specifically. And, just looking at some of the numbers on where Democrats had gains was women. And we know, with women's reproductive rights, we're pretty much directly on the line. And the Democrats, for, good or bad, really put that out there to women voters specifically. And I mean, it seems pretty clear that that was something that women cared about and helped the Democrats to keep the Senate to a certain extent and women to show up to vote. So that's kind of an interesting thing. But I don't really have anything else for you. I'm here to answer questions though, and I'm really excited to be here and to hear from the other panelists and the audience, whether they're on Zoom or whether they are in person. So yeah, thank you.
Let you go. We will come back with questions for all the panelists in a few minutes. But Amber, let me ask you to maybe dig a little deeper with respect to women and the women's vote in across the nation. We certainly saw the influence here in Pennsylvania. I don't think there's any doubt that John Fetterman is the next United States Senator because of women, particularly in suburban Pittsburgh and also in Philadelphia, where women really were key to victories in these counties. But I wanted to ask you about another group that maybe we'll talk about generally in a minute, but perhaps you can lend your wisdom to it, and that is young people. From your perspective, did younger folks turn out to vote in numbers that surprised you? And do you think in the end, it made a difference in some of these races?
Yeah, I mean, that's a good question. I'm not that surprised by like the number of young people voting or not voting, it seems. And I can let the other folks, Alan probably runs all the numbers on all of this, maybe a good throw that into the regression analysis. We can put age in there as well. Yeah, explain some more variance. But yeah, I think, and one of the things I would like to say, particularly with the women's vote or for young people who show up to vote on behalf of like women's reproductive rights, is that we get a lot more pissed off when somebody takes something away from us. And that is a feature of mobilization. So as I was just teaching one of my classes today, one of the things that the emotion that predicts collective action and mobilization is anger. And you get angry when somebody takes something from you. And so in the past, we've seen, our figures like Donald Trump and those types really conceptualize what the Democrats are taking away from, their supporters and things like that. And so they've actually, done a really good job at creating a sense of grievance that people are taking something from them. But then when you have something like abortion taken from women and taken from, half of the United States, you have people who do show up to vote on those types of issues. And it's because it's a grievance thing and you make people mad and they turn up. So I guess if we learn anything from people like Trump and his types of folks is that make people mad and they actually do stuff. But otherwise, we're just pretty complacent.
I love that analysis. I think there's no doubt that when people take something from you, you feel it and you react to it. But there's also the campaign in which you threaten, in which you say that a right is going to be taken away from you. For example, Social Security. Mm-hmm. How many times did we see in commercials here in Pennsylvania, at least, that the certain Republican candidates, Mehmet Oz, Doug Mastriano, were going to take away our Social Security benefits? I say ours because I happen to be of the age where I can now get a check. I'm not sure that is as strong an argument that something is going to happen as is the argument something has happened. And so I don't know whether you have any thoughts about that, Amber.
Yeah, I think that, I couldn't have said that better myself, is because, how many women like myself knew that this was coming for, coming for abortion. We all knew that, but people didn't get angry and show up until it was actually taken from them, because there's always the sense of like, oh, things could get better. This might not actually happen, right? We can always kind of convince ourselves down that optimistic road, but when it is actually taken from us, then it becomes reality, right? And I think your analysis of that is perfect.
Well, thank you very much. We'll come back to some of these questions in a minute. I'm going to move on to our next panelist, who I love. He's one of my favorite columnists. He's a fellow Pittsburgh guy, Tony Norman, so you can see him up there on the screen. Tony Norman has been a columnist. Well, of course, we identified him with the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette for many years. I'm not quite sure what the status of all that is these days. Some of you may know, and I'm a good union guy. I'm a member of SAG-AFTRA. There's a strike going on at the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette at the moment. But Tony has been a tremendous columnist for the Post-Gazette over the years. He's Next Pittsburgh, chair of the International Free Expression Project, partner in the National A.W. Mellon Democratic Futures Project, former president of the National Society of Newspaper Columnists. He's a member of the Black Media Federation. I once got an award from the Black Media Federation, which I'm very proud of, years ago. But this guy, Tony Norman, what I love about him is that he's so insightful and he has his real finger on the pulse of what's happening for real average folks in Pittsburgh, not the high and mighty, but those who really who live and struggle in our society. So, Tony, I hope I didn't say more than I should have about you, but I love you, man, and I'm glad you're part of this. Thank you for being here. Tony, the floor is yours. I think you're muted.
Okay, here we go.
There we go. We don't, never, folks, mute Tony Norman.
or maybe start muting me tonight. Who knows? Well, to answer a question that was thrown Amber's way, this election was the second highest turnout for young voters 18 to 29 in the past 30 years. So this was truly a historic election for young people because of many of the things that Amber talked about. The question of abortion is unsettled in Pennsylvania. It was unsettled because Doug Mastriano promised that he would unwind the right to have an abortion. That created an existential threat that maybe you didn't have in a lot of other states. So here in Pennsylvania, young people in particular turned out in massive numbers because, as Amber said, they felt a right, an important right was being taken away. And it would have been because the Republican Party in Pennsylvania is united in its quest to end bodily autonomy for for women. And of course, the things that you mentioned, John, Social Security was going to be on the chopping block. There's just a sort of sketchy relationship with healthcare here between the Republicans don't really like a lot of it. And so, and the fact is that in many ways, Pennsylvania was a training ground. I think we're the third, now John, you'll correct me, we were the third or fourth state to contribute the most insurrectionists to January 6th. I mean, we just have a large population of pissed off people who don't like the government. And, you know, there's this whole tradition of anti-authority here. And I think that it got to the point where folks were realizing that their democracy, and this is no overstatement, that their democracy was, if not on the chopping block, then pretty close to it, because you had election deniers at the top of the Republican ticket. You know, Dr. Oz was a petite and sort of like a polite election denier, but Doug Mastriano, that dude was scary. Christian nationalism, very, very scary stuff. We know that's a reality here in Pennsylvania. All you got to do is drive the back roads. You see the signs. You know that there are people that wouldn't mind having an authoritarian state. They look, you know, very nostalgically towards, you know, Pennsylvania in the 1600s, the 1700s, and so forth. And they think they want to remodel the state in the image of a more Christian, you know, oriented state. And that's just not possible. If you're Jewish, if you're of any minority religion, the idea of handing the keys to the Pennsylvania car to a someone who is a bona fide Christian nationalist would have been horrifying. And so leading up to that vote last week, there was a day or two when I was in a fetal position because I believed all the polls like everyone else did. I believed all the polls, the junk polls, the legitimate polls, I believed them all. And I was loudly pessimistic. And so it was quite a relief to go and vote last Tuesday and to see the results pour in Tuesday night, because it reaffirmed my faith in my fellow citizen. And I never should have given up that faith. And so from now on, my attitude towards punditry and prognostication when it comes to polling is to just ignore it all until people are coming out of the polls, are coming after voting. Then you ask them, okay, who'd you vote for, and so forth and so on. That'll give me a much more accurate picture. And I'll save, I mean, I used to have a head full of hair before last week. No, I didn't. I was always, but the point is, I believe the prognosticators, and I shouldn't have, and neither should America have, because in the end, we as Alan illustrated, we actually a lot of surprising things happen, and I think that only happens when people actually exercise their right to vote without any sense of determinism. Now, there's a tension there, obviously, and I guess we can talk about that, because you do need polls to give an indication of what's coming and what the chances are. I mean, it's only natural. We're a species that needs to have a sense of what's going on. But I think that there's a lesson there about not relying on polls the way that we do, because I think that's unhealthy. And I think that's a recent phenomenon.
one question, and I'll open this up to everybody again in a few minutes after we finish with our last panelist. But let me just ask you, from your perception and your observation here in Pennsylvania, how did you see voter suppression in any way, shape, or form going on? We know about voter denialism. We know about the denialism with respect to the 2020 election. But what about voter suppression? We hear states where that is perhaps more visible than in Pennsylvania,
Right.
But I'm just curious what your take is on Pennsylvania in particular.
I personally, John, I did not see any indications of that either in the media or in person here in Pennsylvania. I think that there was, if we talk about voter suppression in a more abstract way, like there was a lot of propaganda. There was a lot of propaganda about the red wave and how that was just going to wipe out the Democrats for a whole generation. And so that had a very tangible effect on a lot of people, myself included. I was, palpably depressed for about a week going into Tuesday. And it really affected my consumption of news. I stopped reading as many websites as I used to because I was anticipating the apocalypse. But that's not voter suppression. That just made me go out and vote. But I wonder how many people decided that what's the use? But the fact is that, like I said earlier, young people turned out in record numbers. And I think, women turned out in record numbers because they had to save, protect a sacred right that they've had for the last half century. So I did not see any kind of voter suppression that would have worked other than the usual propaganda that sort of picked up, oftentimes by legacy media, just uncritically churning, the propaganda from, the far right. The prevalence of these junk polls is just absolutely appalling. So, yeah. But to answer your question, John, no, I haven't seen anything, that was, the traditional voter suppression stuff.
Well, I'm going to make a suggestion of something I saw in Pennsylvania. I talked to Commissioner Maggi about this just a little bit ago, and that is the different rules in Pennsylvania with respect to mail-in balloting. For example, the question of whether or not an undated ballot received on time, perfectly valid, filled out properly, usually by a senior citizen who happened to write in their birth date instead of today's date, and their ballot isn't going to get counted as a result. I think that's a form of voter suppression. I think another form of voter suppression is the fact that most counties in Pennsylvania did not alert people to the fact that their ballots had a problem. And by not alerting them, there was no way to cure the ballot or to even alert someone you should vote provisionally so you can debate this issue after the election. I find that to be a form of voter suppression. So, and I covered these issues on television, as you would expect me to do.
Very astute.
But that would, that's just it's a different kind of voter suppression. It may not be the kind we see in Georgia or Texas or Florida or some of those other states. But I think we do have some evidence of it in Pennsylvania. We can come back and talk about that in a moment. Thank you very much, Tony. Appreciate your contributions. We're going to be back in a few minutes. I want to turn to our fourth. He's certainly not he may be the last on the panel for the moment, but Lou Jacobson has been a friend for more than a couple decades at least. We go back many, many, many years. And Lou is a political columnist. He's senior correspondent at PolitiFact, telling us what's true and what isn't true when it comes to politics. He's the senior author of a number of editions of the Almanac of American Politics. That's kind of a Bible for political scientists. He's been a visiting scholar at a number of universities where he teaches students how to contribute to regional PolitiFact projects. And and every time he comes, he likes to come in person because he ends up interviewing some of us and then goes back and writes a column. So we really appreciate having Lou Jacobson here. Lou, thank you for being here and The floor is all yours.
Thanks, John. I'm going to start where Alan left off. He did a great job on the Senate and the House. I'm going to talk a little bit about something that I focus on in a lot of my reporting, which is down ballot races. I'll start with governorships. Alan did say that the Democrats gained a net of 3 governorships in the recent election. The thing that jumped out at me is that's a pretty small change in the status quo. Now, 2 of those 3 races were in Maryland and Massachusetts, where a GOP governor, very moderate GOP governor in both states, stepped down, and the GOP in the state nominated a very much Trump-aligned candidate who was not going to win a very blue state like that. So those 2 were expected going into the election. They're expected to flip. In terms of Nevada, that was the only genuine flip, as it turns out. That went from Democrats to the GOP. Beyond that, every party that held the governorship, what is that, 46, I guess? Every party that held the governorship prior to the election will still have the governorship going forward, which is pretty striking when you think that Congress's ratings are in the toilet. Joe Biden is somewhere in the 40s in terms of approval. Donald Trump is even lower. The Supreme Court even has gone down in the past year. The direction of the country, strongly negative, is what people say. And yet the governors, mostly reelected, 90% or more. It strikes me as a little bit of a paradox. My best explanation for that is, well, I guess I have kind of 2. One is that in general, these governors have been pretty popular. Like there's a 50-state survey Morning Consult does of all the governors. And the last time it was done that I saw, there are only 3 or 4 governors who are actually underwater in terms of their approval ratings. So basically, voters are not going to throw out of office 99 times out of 100 a governor who they approve of their job. If you ask why are they so popular, I think it's probably more the absence of anything. It's the absence of budget crises in the state, and we have perhaps to thank for that Joe Biden's I guess American Rescue Plan, which had a lot of aid for states, and states have been able to use that money to bolster their finances. And I think that took away a lot of the kinds of things that tend to get governors, out, I guess, booted out of office. If they're cutting schools, if they're cutting other social programs that are popular, that is something that really gets voters, or if they're raising taxes to cover the cost of those programs. Because that has not been as much of a problem, I think governors have tended to escape the negative vibes that a lot of voters are feeling in terms of the other offices. State legislatures, as Alan said, at least 3 have flipped to the Democrats, possibly Pennsylvania, as John has mentioned. Also, New Hampshire is a possibility. Arizona, I don't think has been settled yet. And not a single vulnerable Democratic chamber fell to the GOP, which is quite striking. And it's really, to me, the reverse of 2020. When going into the election, it seemed like the Democrats were really kind of on the hunt, on the prowl, to oust Republicans in a bunch of chambers in swing states. Turns out Joe Biden won the presidency in 2020, but he didn't have coattails at all. And Democrats lost ground in the House. And in terms of the state legislatures, actually Democrats, the only chambers that flipped in the entire country were 2 in New Hampshire, and those went to the GOP. This is the flip side of that. It seemed like everything was going in the GOP's direction. All the historical patterns of a midterm eletion, Joe Biden's low approval rating, and lo and behold, not a single GOP sorry, not a single Democratic chamber flipped to the, sorry, not a single, Democratic chamber flipped to the GOP, and the Democrats gained a couple. It just goes to show, how much we know going in. It's just so hard to predict, and it seems clear in retrospect, but it certainly was not clear going in to me that the Democrats would do so well with the state legislatures. We've talked a little bit about Secretary of State races and the election deniers. Basically, for the Secretary of State races in the battleground states, the ones that are, not strongly red or blue, all of the election denying secretaries of state candidates lost. Some fairly narrowly, but they did all lose. And frankly, the big question for me going into into election day for basically the entire year before election day was, okay, you have these election denying Republican candidates trying to win the Secretary of State races. What are the Republican voters going to do? Are they going to simply see the R by the person's name and support them? Or are they going to pick and choose between, say, a gubernatorial candidate is a mainstream establishment candidate and the Secretary of State candidate is not? Are they going to pick and choose between those two and support one and not the other? And if you'd asked me the day before the election, I would have said, I have no idea if that's going to happen or not. Well, it turns out that they did pick and choose. And that's, and not just in one state, but basically in all of the key battleground states. Talk a little bit about ballot measures. The biggest ones, of course, were the abortion measures. There were three on the pro-abortion rights side: California, Vermont, and Michigan, all passed fairly easily. I think most in double digits, if not all. And then there were two on the anti-abortion side, where voters in two red states, Kentucky and in Montana, voted those down. So basically siding with the pro-abortion rights side. And that follows the same thing that happened in Kansas earlier in the year. What was also striking to me here, those are clearly major victories. I think it's clear that the abortion issue in general had a lot to do with the Democrats' strong showing in a lot of races, governor's races, particularly in some of the swing states. But the flip side of that, and I think it's equally important in some ways, is that there are close to a dozen states, I believe, where a sitting governor basically presided over or actively signed legislation that basically banned abortion in many cases, in most cases without the exceptions in terms of rape and incest. So these are pretty strict measures. In those strongly red states, all of those governors won a new term on the same day, often by double digits, from Florida to Indiana, Georgia, Arkansas, Alabama, so forth, and the Dakotas. While certainly in the battleground states and the blue states, abortion rights mattered as a key issue in how voters voted. In the more red states, while there were a couple of ballot initiatives, it's true, where the question was directly asked what your view is in terms of abortion policy. Voters in those red states did not punish governors because they saw either they are in favor of those policies in terms of abortion rights, or because they see so much else positive in those governors in terms of their outlooks and policies. I think I'll stop there.
Lou, thank you very much. I appreciate that. I want to make sure we have time for questions, and I think if you're on Zoom via Q&A, use the Q&A function, and Laura, you'll get that. And is it Mike? Chris, I'm sorry, I apologize. Chris has the microphone for folks in the audience here. Let me just first open this up because I did ask some questions as we prepare to get questions from those of you who are here. Let me ask, if I may, from either Lou or Alan or Amber or Tony, on some of the other questions that I threw out to people, whether any of you have a perspective. For example, on the issue of voter turnout, any explanations for what happened on election day from your perspective? Go ahead, Alan.
Well, we know the turnout was high for a midterm election. Probably not quite as high as it was 4 years ago in 2018, but that was the highest turnout in a midterm election in over 100 years. So I think Michael McDonald, who's the kind of guru of voter turnout, was estimating a few days ago that we were looking at maybe a 47% of eligible voters turning out, which may not sound high, but it is very high for a midterm election. So the recent elections have generally been high turnout. I want to touch on a couple of things that people have mentioned just briefly, if I could, because I think they're really interesting. This was really in many ways a status quo election. We're not big swings one way or the other. Small swing in the House, small swing or no swing in the Senate. One incumbent governor losing, that's all. No incumbents in the Senate losing. Very few House incumbents losing. So despite the fact that voters are supposedly upset, they didn't really do much to change things. Republicans likely to take over the House, but a very small swing there. We're in an era of deep polarization in American politics, and I think that's as a result, you don't get big swings. The voters are kind of locked into their choices, and you see that reflected in the presidential results. You see that reflected in the midterm results. On governor's popularity, I think that Lou touched on a very important point. Governors are benefiting and have benefited in the last couple of years, in general, whether they're Republicans or Democrats, from the good parts of the Biden economy and Biden's policies. You know, the low unemployment, the job growth, budget surpluses, and the aid they're getting from the federal government. So they can do things that are popular and they don't have to raise taxes. They don't get blamed for inflation. Okay. Nobody blames governors for inflation. So only Biden and to some extent the Democrats get blamed for that. Last but not least, one of the reasons why I think we had a lot of us, Tony mentioned this earlier, we're kind of like had a lot of fear and trepidation going into this election. If you're a Democrat, it was the polls. But here's the thing. There are a lot of the junk polls primarily. There are some good polls out there. And I think what we saw in this election, when we look at the polling in states from Pennsylvania to Arizona to Nevada to Michigan, Wisconsin, all over the place, that some of these junk polls flooded in the last couple of weeks, especially polls like Trafalgar, polls like Insider Advantage, polls like Signal with a C, some polls that coefficient polls I've never heard of before. I don't know who's funding them, but I know they were bad, and they shifted the averages. There were so many of these junk polls in the last couple of weeks. They shifted the averages toward these Republican candidates, made it look like this was going to be a Republican wave election. If you look at the solid established polls, generally they did a pretty good job, but they just were swamped, by these junk polls. So I'll stop with that.
Interesting point. One of the things when I report polls on television, I talk a little bit about margin of error because people do not understand what margin of error is all about. And if you have a plus or minus 3% margin of error and the poll is 43-40, it could be it could be the reverse. The guy who's ahead by 3 could be behind by 3. And so I don't think people have an understanding of that. And a lot of times the media glosses over margin of error and we don't even report it. I try to make sure we have it on at the bottom of all our screens when we show something. But even just showing it, you still have to explain it to most people to understand. Some good points there, Alan. Thank you very much. Let me ask Amber and Tony and Lou if they have any points they want to pick up on anything that Alan just said.
Yeah, just picking up on the poll question. I think it's kind of a good news, bad news story. The good news is that the solid polls that Alan is talking about, those that are independent and who are well established, did fairly well this cycle.
But let me just ask you,
Yeah.
do you mean the university polls like the Quinnipiac poll or?
Yeah, I mean, I have to say I haven't looked too closely at this, but in general, those are the kinds of polls.
Alan, is that what you mean by legitimate polls? Universities?
Well, polls that have been around for a while and that don't clearly don't have a partisan slant and not trying to push a particular side. So yes, Quinnipiac, yes, this New York Times Siena polls I thought were generally quite good and quite accurate. Turned out to be pretty accurate. Monmouth, there's a bunch of these. And then even the Fox News, CNN, in general, I think, and YouGov, which is an online poll, do a pretty good job. They're not perfect, but some of these, junk polls, I think the margin of error is one thing, and you're right, it's important to put that in there. But they missed the mark by a mile in some of these races. They were just way off. We had polls, showing like Gretchen Whitmer was ahead by 1 point in Michigan, and she won by like 12 or 13 or 14 or something like that. The New Hampshire race, Bolduc was leading in some of the late polls, late junk polls, and and Hassan won by 9 points. So, you can't explain that based on random error.
Did you?
That's fine. So the good news is that the independent, well-respected polls appear to have done pretty well. The bad news to me is I'm still mystified at why the polls are right, because people, on their cell phones are not picking up calls they don't know. I don't know how they're getting good data still, and I'm wondering, long term if it's sustainable, or if there's some other sort of model that needs to be turned to in order to fill this need.
Yeah, I will listen to a poll. I will give a non-committal answer to everything for fear that it's somebody who might actually be faking it and wanting to know how John Delano really feels about something. But I want to hear the whole poll. I know I'm the only one in my family who will do that. Nobody else will complete a poll. And hey,
the New York Times Siena poll did something interesting. They did an experiment. This was like Nate Cohn, who's the New York Times data guru, was kind of running this, and they tried paying people. They did an experiment where they paid people to respond to the poll. And that increased the response rate dramatically. The interesting thing is that they found the results weren't that different. So and maybe somehow, even with these very low response rates, that the legitimate polls that are not deliberately trying to skew the results in a certain direction generally are still doing a pretty good job.
Yeah, I mean, I'd like
to. Yeah, go ahead.
Oh, sorry. I would like to point out just, from, I guess, the psychological perspective on junk polls is not only is it giving us bad information, right? It's people tend to pick out the evidence that supports what they already believe. So if you were for Gretchen and you're reading these polls that are like, oh, she's up, then all of a sudden the election wasn't legitimate, right? And so we've seen this kind of over and over, wherein then it really fires people up because they feel like they can't buy into the process. And that's because the source of the information is phony in this case. And so I think that's something to keep in mind. And we also have some data which we've shown that when you give people like numbers surrounding consensus of candidates, then people tend to legitimize in their minds that candidate as a leader. And so if people are looking again at some of those junk polls, and that's where they're getting their information, and like, oh, look, most of us are voting for candidate X, right? Or most of us are voting for candidate Y. Now this candidate must be a legitimate leader. And so then they're actually more likely to go out and support that person as a leader when they view that poll. So I mean, I just think it's kind of an interesting thing on how like there's the danger of us having, obviously the misinformation and not being able to predict the election, but also it might have ramifications for the election itself based on who's viewing it.
That it bothers me, and I'm on every candidate's mailing list. And I deliberately put myself by going onto their websites and typing an email in, making sure. But you often find candidates, on one hand, declaring publicly that they're ahead by 5 points, and then sending you an email saying, oh, the sky is falling. There's a poll out that shows me behind by 2 points. Send me $100. You know, those kinds of, that kind of mechanism to really, on one hand, declare victory, and on the other saying, I'm losing, help me out. And I think that just sort of, again, cheapens the whole polling operation. You don't know what to believe or not believe.
And who it picks on, right? Like for you in that case, sorry to butt in, but for you in that case, like you receive both of those based on like the different mailers that you're on. But if you're already a supporter, for example, they assume that they're going to get your vote. Then the email comes begging you for money. But the other folks that they don't assume are going to have the vote, and I'm using they as if it's some malevolent thing. I sound like a conspiracy theorist, but let's just go on. But if you are the one who's targeting that this candidate is up by 5%, they're targeting you in that sense because they don't think they have your vote yet. And they're hoping, if you're on the fence, that it can jump you, like push you towards what the consensus is of that candidate.
Right. Yeah. And I think, we have to also allow room for the likelihood that a narrative of a red wave is inherent. I mean, that's going to be used by the folks who lose. Well, luckily in this case, only Carrie Lake, as far as I know, is contesting the election as fraudulent. But 2 years ago, that would have been an excuse for the election denial folks to say, look, see, the polls said this, and it was taken away from us. See, and so there's the narrative has a bias in it. The narrative going into this election had a pro-Republican narrative because of the junk polls. I think Alan's explanations were perfectly correct.
Well, it's more than that, Tony. It's more than that. It's historical.
Yeah.
We always expect in the midterms the party in the White House to lose a lot of seats.
Except for 92. In 92, George Bush had George W. Bush had the bounce from, rally around the flag.
2002.
2002. What did I say? I'm sorry. 2002. And so, it isn't just like a straight line determinism.
That's true.
And that we have to begin to allow for the possibility that people can exercise a certain amount of agency and freedom, especially as the stakes rise. If you're looking at a combination of an autocratic, like potential presidential candidate and a party that is committed to showing him, fiat at every opportunity, and you have such combustible times as what we're living through.
Right.
The narrative is dangerous.
Yeah. I think one of the other questions historically, and I'm a historian, I love history, political history as much as anything. It was this year, 2022, an anomaly.
Yes.
Will it be viewed as an anomaly?
Yes.
Alan's going to answer. I would say we don't know yet, because we could see something like this is sort of what Tony suggests. Maybe what happened this year is going to happen again and again and again. And so our old historical precedents no longer are operative. Well, I don't know.
Here's why it's an anomaly. It's an anomaly because in the past, in those midterm elections where the president's party has done relatively well, and there have been some like that, like 2002, like 1998, there was an obvious explanation. And the obvious explanation is that you had an incumbent president with an approval rating above 60%, and voters with strong support for the incumbent president and the president's party. But in this midterm election, what makes this anomalous is that Biden's approval rating is 42% or so. And voters say they're unhappy with the status quo. They're unhappy with the economy. And yet, somehow, for other reasons, the Republicans fell short and did not achieve their objectives. Oh, absolutely. So it was part of it. Part of it, Dobbs, abortion, but also extremism in general, threats to democracy. I think that all those things together, I think, drove enough voters out to turn out, and also to vote, in some swing voters, to vote for Democrats who might otherwise have been inclined to vote Republican this year.
Yeah, great analysis. Let me turn to both Laura and Chris. If we have questions, I want to make sure that we get them in before we wrap up in about 15 minutes. And I do have the prognostications. And then I have a blank sheet of paper where I'm going to get a bunch of new ones for 2024. But Laura, go ahead, please.
So there is a pair of questions in the Q&A that both relate to election denialism. So the first one asked about the psychology behind denialism and whether the suppression of the red wave will somehow counterweigh that. And then the second one was also about denialism, saying that election deniers lost, but Ron DeSantis won. So is it really the issues or the personalities that are making the difference here? So I guess people want to hear a little bit more about denialism.
Okay, well, you asked the psychological question, so maybe we should go to Dr. Amber, who can provide that perspective. What do you make of denialism?
Well, I've got a lot to say about that. One of the things, and I always try to stress this to my students as well, is that like people are living in a universe in which their perception is their reality, right? So for the folks who are truly denying that Biden won the election, that is their reality. And they believe that Biden did not win the election, that Trump won the election, right? And they're going to hold fast to that because they think they're right. And they are also turning to information sources who are telling them that they are right as well. And so that bubble is getting smaller and smaller. And then if they come to a forum like this, where they hear somebody like me or anyone on this panel say, well, they're absolutely wrong, they're going to be like, what do you know, right? Because expertise is only coming from within for them. So that source of information is so incredibly important. And I loved the question about DeSantis, right? Like, yeah, that's really interesting, because if people start going for DeSantis over Trump, is it that different? Like, right? Is it all that different? And so that's still that personality bit, and he might come off as far more polished and all of these other things, and that may very well help him. But I think that's a really interesting position to be in. And I think that when you get those personalities, what it does is it captures people's attention, right? And that's the first step in moving someone is, hey, I'm going to jump really loud, or I'm going to make you all wait, and then I'm going to announce whether or not I'm going to run. That announcement hasn't come down yet, has it? So, make people wait, capture the attention in that moment, and then push them towards you. And that's what someone like Trump does incredibly well, regardless of how it's coming off at the moment. I think it's still going to benefit him. And then on top of that, Ron DeSantis has done that very well too, in somewhat of a different fashion, but it's not like ideologically it's all that different. So.
Interesting. Let me ask the other panelists. Do you want to comment on that question? You don't have to.
I mean, one of the things that's going on, that was exactly right, that people see their views reinforced constantly. This belief, because if you are believe that Trump, the election was stolen from Trump, you're probably watching Fox News. You're probably getting your information predominantly from, conservative media outlets that are, often reinforcing that view. And we tend to live in communities. We're surrounded by people who share our views for the most part. So I hear interviews with folks, even here in the state of Georgia, the people who live up in North Georgia, which is very Republican, who are saying, I know Biden, lost. I know Trump won that election because I don't know anyone who voted for Biden. And you just want to scream and then saying, yeah, but, come to Atlanta. I said, there's nobody here voted for Trump. Not entirely true, but, it's just, there's so much, we're becoming so homogenized in our interactions and the people we interact with and talk to about politics, especially if we're politically engaged, that it's easy to come to believe these things.
Worrisome. I mean, I will say this, that it worries me that both liberals and conservatives are living in their own world. And, you know, you find it just as much on the left wing and progressives as you do with conservatives, where they're, you know, they reject anybody or any form of media that disputes their particular positions on issues. You know, you'll be inclined to read the city paper, not Wall Street Journal. So, you know, and that troubles me, because you're not really broadening. There's nothing wrong with holding a strong position, left or right, but at least test it against other ideas.
There's a difference, though, between the left and right when it comes to media consumption. You look at on the right, when you look at Republicans and conservatives and here, that if you look, which media do they trust? Where do they get their information? Fox News is so dominant; it's just mind-boggling. There are a few other smaller ones, but you know, it's in a very dominant position. There's nothing like that on the left. Liberals and Democrats tend to get their information from a wider variety of sources. And they're not necessarily as ideologically coherent. You know, some of them are, but so there is a difference. It's somewhat asymmetrical here when it comes to insulation from reality. So I'd have to say that on the right, the folks are more insulated from reality than folks on the left. And we see that in the election denialism. I don't think on the left, we haven't seen defeated candidates claim that the election was stolen. We haven't seen them claim, you know, that there was, you know, the votes of their supporters were suppressed by and large. Okay, so we do see some of that, but not nearly as much.
That's true. Any questions from the audience here? Yes, sir. First, we'll grab a mic here. The mic is for the purpose of our Zoom audience.
Sure. First of all, I'd just like to thank everybody, the panel, Dr. Tunerman. I'd like to also thank Alan, because I'm writing a term paper and I'm using him quite frequently as a source. So that now relates to my question, which can be boiled down to, is my paper's on polarization. Is this political polarization healthy? My view in my paper, I kind of discussed that we are seeing more activation of like politics. We are seeing people get more involved. But by and large, is that good? I'm pretty opposed to an apathetic public, but I feel like we are really testing the strains of democracy. So that's my question. Is polarization
it's a great question. It's a great question. And does polarization activate people in a way that's negative?
Yes.
I
don't think there's any question that it does. I mean, we're seeing that the greater the divide between parties, the higher the stakes. When people believe that it makes a big difference whether one party or the other wins, they're more likely to participate. That's the good side. But there is a negative side to it. Going along with that disagreement, we see this intense dislike of the opposing side, which is what I call negative partisanship. And we're seeing, and that feeds into this belief that we can't accept the other side winning because they're trying to destroy the country and destroy our society as we know it. And they have to be stopped at all costs. And therefore it feeds into this election denialism. And listen, it could happen on the other side as well. If we have an election where another election where, say, a Democratic candidate wins the popular vote by even a pretty decisive margin and loses in the Electoral College, I'm worried about what would happen, especially if some of the states' decisions in some of the states are tainted, by individuals who are in positions to skew the outcome, secretaries of state and so on. Fortunately, that's not as likely as I thought it was going to be, because those election deniers, by and large, failed. So at least so far, but we'll see what happens in 2024, especially if Trump is running again.
Or did you want to comment on this one?
Yeah, I mean, I completely agree with Alan's sentiment there. And the further people, the bigger the wedge they put between, the more dehumanization you get on either side. So we're getting to a point where the other side does not have, it's not just their opinion, but everything that they put forth is like destroying our way of life, right? And so you don't have a place where people can come together on stuff like that. And so, you know, the more we see that, the more I mean, with COVID, for example, one of the things that we should have seen, if you want to come from this, like, you know, psychological perspective, where we're all under this big umbrella, we have this big existential threat, we should come together. What happened? We've moved further and further apart. And one of the things that we show is that the research that we do shows is that the more uncertainty people experience, the more likely they are to polarize, right? And it's because there is a sense of safety and security in that enclave that's really different from the other side, right? And so, and that's, people are using that to protect themselves psychologically to a certain extent, which, yeah.
And the fact is that
I was going to say, you know, as a television journalist here in Western Pennsylvania with the #1 TV station, I have the opportunity to interview all these guys, except for Mastriano, who refused to talk to anyone in the media. And what I found is that, particularly with politicians, you know, I had a terrific interview. I had several terrific interviews with Donald Trump. He's a really nice guy on a one-to-one chit-chatty level when you interview some of these folks. And yet I was called all kinds of names because I interviewed him. I had the same experience when I interviewed Barack Obama. I had 8 interviews with Barack Obama over the years. And I was called, you know, the N-word lover, you know, all that kind of stuff, because I interviewed Barack Obama. You know, so you really get pilloried depending on who you're talking to as a journalist. And you sort of learn to let all that, just let it go. Let it go. I mean, do your job, do what you do. But remember that no matter who you interview, because we are in a polarized society, that the consequence of interviewing somebody that people don't like is very negative. So it was a great question. Thank you for asking that. Let me, we're going to wrap up here, I know, in a few minutes. I just want to make sure. Are there other questions in the audience? Yes, ma'am. Go back. You got the.
I know in Pennsylvania, we are kind of a swing state, and it's, from what I've noticed, it's more rural areas that are red, which is the majority of PA, and urban areas that are blue. But Doug Mastriano lost by a lot, and Dr. Oz and John Fetterman were kind of neck and neck. Do any of you have maybe an in-depth reasoning for why that was?
Yeah. Well, I can offer a lot of comments on that, but we got a panel here, so we'll start with
there was there was split ticket voting. You know, there was a fair amount of split ticket voting in some of these races. Pennsylvania was a prime case of that, where obviously there were a fair number of people who voted for Shapiro and Oz. You know, a minority. It's still a pretty small minority, but enough to produce that difference in outcome, where Shapiro, you know, Mastriano lost by like 16 points, I think, and Oz only lost by about 4 or 5. So, and we saw some other states, you know, New Hampshire, even more so, you know, between the governor and the Senate race, you know, there's a lot of ticket splitting going on there. So candidates still matter. And you know, incumbency still matters, but, you know, Mastriano was just a terrible candidate. He was just an awful candidate. And
yeah, in terms of the numbers, because I think sometimes we do get mixed up, particularly when we look at percentages. Donald Trump carried Pennsylvania by 44,000 votes in 2016. Pat Toomey, when he defeated Katie McGinney 6 years ago, won with about 85,000 votes. 87,000 votes. That was about the number that Joe Biden carried Pennsylvania in 2020, 80,000 votes. John Fetterman won his Senate race. The last I looked, it was over 170,000 votes. It was in the scheme of Pennsylvania, it was a big victory. Not as big as Josh Shapiro, who won by 700,000 votes, but nonetheless winning by 180, 190, whatever the final count is with Fetterman, it was still a very significant victory. So I agree that there was ticket splitting. I agree there were people who went in and voted for Shapiro and Oz, but it wasn't as severe as it could have been because, again, always go back to Trump. Trump won Pennsylvania by just 44,000 votes. And that's kind of your baseline. That's kind of I mean, I can give you lots of analysis on that, but I'll shut up. Any other thoughts, comments, questions? Another?
I think it's a good one for, so someone wrote and said, I'm a 23-year-old leftist transgender woman who votes in every election and works as a poll worker in my rural town. I'm not the average voter, but people like me either get a lot of media attention or not much at all. I'm wondering what groups, issues, or stories are currently being overreported or underreported for this election. What should we maybe be hearing more of or hearing less of?
That's a great question, too. First of all, thank you for being a poll worker. We need people working the polls, and I'm presuming this is somebody who spends the whole day at the polls. My mother did that for like 50 years at the same polling place. She knew every single human being who walked in there, which is why we have no voter fraud, because they know all these folks one way or the other.
And especially important for the younger generation to start doing that.
Oh, I think it's great. But in terms of the question of what stories are overtold and are undertold, interesting.
Well, in this, one thing I'd say in this election, I would say to this person is that, and a story that is starting to get told is that we see in this election, there was real breakthroughs here by LGBTQ candidates. We're seeing large and for some women candidates as well being elected governors, for example. But LGBTQ candidates being elected governors, being elected to Congress, being elected to state legislatures in growing numbers. So it's clear that those sort of barriers are starting to break down. They're not gone entirely, but I think that's a very significant development that that deserves even more attention than it's getting.
Couldn't agree with you more.
Absolutely.
The governor of Massachusetts, openly gay woman.
Yeah. Oregon, governor of Oregon.
The other one, yeah. I sometimes think, though, when you talk about stories that we overtell, I do think the media fell into the trap of just over talking about the red wave. And, we just kept saying that over and over and over again. And I know it was historically based. I know we could rely on whether they're real or junk polls to say it. But I think part of the problem with the media is that we tend to be a bunch of copycats. And so we hear one group say this or one form of media say it, then we say it. And, before you know it, it's safer that way. Yeah, exactly, Lou. We're part of the crowd.
One thing in terms of the issues, I think it's interesting to look at inflation. Obviously, huge issue, very, very important economic issue. And in the opinion polls about what issues you care about most, it generally finished number one by a mile for several months leading up to the vote. What I think was not fully understood at the time is what that means to voters. Obviously, they are concerned about it, but did they think that it was all Joe Biden's fault and the Democrats' fault, and therefore they're going to punish them at the polls for it? I think that's a whole lot less clear. I think that it may be that voters may have been smarter than or more I guess nuanced in their thinking about that issue, in that they were very concerned about it, but they didn't think that the political leaders are the ones to solve the problem. The Fed is.
Right. I think voters are a lot more sophisticated than we give them credit for. I mean, I think Tuesday, if nothing else, proved that the voters have the right to have the last word. You know, whether the polling is good or bad, the fact is that until the citizen speaks, via the poll, nothing is settled. And, we might be pleasantly surprised by the outcome. And I think that that's what makes democracies very, very dynamic. If we go into these elections thinking there's no inelasticity at all and that everything is just sort of baked in and fixed, then our democracy begins to diminish. I have a lot more hope now.
The last comment on that, Tony. I appreciate that upbeat way to end this panel discussion. I want to now share the observations of our panelists from 2 years ago, and then I'm going to ask them for their predictions, which I'll write down here and I'll store away in my yellow folder for 2 years from now, assuming you have us back, Laura. But so, Alan, I'll start with you. Your prediction for the U.S. Senate was that in this election, the Republicans would take the Senate and control 52-48.
Okay.
Didn't quite happen. You did predict.
Well, I only missed by maybe 2.
That's true. You did predict the Republicans would take control of the U.S. House, and that seems pretty likely.
Yeah.
We didn't get any numbers from people on that one. Amber, you described yourself as gutless and made no prediction with respect to the U.S. Senate. I'm not going to let you get away with that for 2024. We'll come back to that.
I just want people to know my deficits, okay? It depends on who's in office and what's going on. It's context specific, man.
I'll tell you. You did predict that the Republicans would win the U.S. House. And so obviously you are right on that. Lou, actually Lou and Tony were identical. You both predicted the Democrats would maintain control of the U.S. Senate, and both of you predicted 50-50. So you were depending on Kamala Harris.
Better than I thought I did.
Yeah. However, you both also predicted the Democrats would take control of the U.S. House, and it looks like they're going to fall 2 or 3 votes shy of that. Close. But,
we'll see. We'll see. Have hope.
Norman's not giving up. We will be back. All right. So here we go. We'll go in reverse order this time. I'm going to start with you, Tony. U.S. Senate in 2024. Who's going to win the U.S. Senate, Republicans or Democrats in 2024?
Well, I think, as was pointed out earlier, Democrats have a difficult map going into 2024. I acknowledge that. And so I believe the Republicans will come blazing back in 2024. But I believe in Pennsylvania, we're going to be
win.
Huh?
I say Bob Casey's up for re-election in 24. He'll win.
Yes, that's what I wanted to say.
Give me a number. What do you think? The Republicans will control the Senate 53-47. You give me the number.
That sounds about right, actually.
Okay.
That sounds about right.
53-47. Lou.
54 GOP, 46 Democrat.
Okay. Amber, are the Republicans going to take control of the Senate or the Democrats?
Well, I mean, I think that hinges on quite a lot of things that I don't have information about right now.
You're talking like a psychologist. I don't want to hear it. Give me an answer.
Okay, well, I do think that the Republicans, I hate doing this. I don't like being wrong. So I think that the Republicans will take the Senate, but I feel like it's going to be closer.
So like 51-49?
Yeah.
Okay, that's fair enough.
And then if you have me back, I'm likely to be wrong. And then I'll say, well, I didn't have all of the variables.
Well, we'll have you back. And you can give whatever excuse you want at the time.
I got lots of them.
Alan, what do you think?
So I think given the map that I talked about earlier, I think Republicans are likely to gain 3 seats. They're likely to pick up Montana, West Virginia, and Ohio. I think Democrats have a good chance to hold the swing states that they now hold, especially if Joe Biden or another Democrat is doing well in the presidential election. That's what we don't know. Obviously, that's crucial. That's crucial. But I'd say 52-48 because I think that they're going to go from 49 to 52. I think Warnock is going to win the runoff, and the Republicans will have 49 seats going into 24 and end up with 52.
All right, great. Real quick, Alan, who controls the House? I don't want numbers, just Republicans or Democrats?
So I think the Democrats will take back the House in 24.
Okay, good. Amber.
I don't know if I'm as optimistic as that. I think Republicans are going to keep it, and I'll likely be wrong, but that's fine.
Lou.
I say Dems.
Dems
take it back.
Okay. Tony.
The Dems are definitely taking it back because the American people are going to be completely disgusted with what has happened in the 2 years.
All right, here's the harder question. And I guess we'll start with, I'm tempted to start with you, Amber, but I won't. I want to know, we'll start with Alan. Alan, who do you think will be the Republican nominee for president, the Democratic nominee for president, and the ultimate winner?
Well, let me preface it by saying that I hope this does not happen. But I still think if I had to guess and say, like, who's the most likely at this point in the two parties, I think it's going to be Trump versus Biden again.
Okay, and who's going to win?
Biden.
All right, Trump, Biden.
But that's not a high probability. I mean, I think it's just like I don't see any, who the alternatives are less likely on both sides.
In 2020, you predicted that Kamala Harris would be the nominee for president. I have the old.
It would win the Democratic nomination.
Yeah.
Well, she came close, got vice president.
Yeah, right. But you did.
I thought I was predicting her that she'd be the vice presidential nominee.
You know what? I mistake. Yeah, you're right. I did. I was vice president, but you also predicted Trump would be reelected. Well, I asked that question. You said no, he would not be reelected.
Okay, so, there you go. I got it right.
So, yeah, you did. So,
don't forget that crucial word, not.
Not. That's true. All right, Amber, who's the Republican nominee in 2024, 2 years from now?
I think it's going to be Trump also.
Okay, and the D's, the Democrat?
Who else do they have? Like, honestly, who else are they going to put up? It's going to be.
Doesn't your governor out there in California want it?
Gavin? I don't think Gavin is not going to appeal to a large sect of the American public. I don't think so. Yeah.
All right. So you're going with Biden again?
Mm-hmm.
Was that a
Oh, yeah. No, I'm fairly confident in that, and I'm not a very confident person. So
okay. And the winner? Trump versus Biden?
Well, that I am less confident about. I think I'm going to go with Biden again, and I don't know if that's optimism talking.
Okay, good.
How about Trump? Trump wins from his jail cell.
Oh. Lou, the GOP nominee.
GOP nominee. I would say DeSantis.
DeSantis, okay. And how about the Democrats?
I don't think Biden will be the nominee. I'm thinking either Amy Klobuchar or Sherrod Brown.
Ooh. Klobuchar or Brown? All right, I'll give you I'll put the two down.
Okay.
And who do you think wins?
That's a great question.
DeSantis or your Klobuchar Brown group?
Let's say DeSantis, but I think it'll be close, and I could see either side winning.
Okay. You don't get to do that.
Yeah.
Just DeSantis. All right, Tony, you get the last word as always. The GOP nominee, who do you think it'll be?
Well, it'll be Trump, but he'll be fatally mauled by a contentious, primary battle with DeSantis. And he'll,
Are you tempted to say DeSanctimonious?
Not at all. That's is a corny nickname, where something like Dull Santis might have worked, but he's not as clever as he used to be. And I think that his VP, Marjorie Taylor Greene, will actually pull that ticket down. And so that'll make it possible for the Democratic, the nominee who will be, Buttigieg and
Buttigieg, yeah,
and Newsom, will be either Newsom or Klobuchar will be the VP.
All right, but
because there's going to be a big emphasis on competence, on getting back to the old-fashioned democratic virtues of techno competence, and there's no one more articulate than the two of them, and they have a weird history and attention that will work perfectly.
Have we ever elected a Rhodes Scholar to the presidency?
Yeah, isn't Kennedy?
Not Kennedy, no. Clinton was.
Oh, you're right.
Bill Clinton, yeah.
So is Buttigieg the winner over Trump?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
All right.
I know that sounds crazy, but yes.
All right. Well, we've got a great. I mean, lots of predictions here. Laura, you definitely have to have us all back in 2 years, but this time in person. This has been a lot of fun. I really appreciate folks hanging with us for the last 90 plus minutes. As always, I've very much enjoyed moderating when you have such 4 distinguished panelists on this program. It's just a lot of fun to do. So I thank everybody. Laura, you get the final word here, so come on.
I'm going to thank you all for being with us and say, I hope I have the fun. We can do it again in 2 years. Lots of fun.
You need funds.
Funds, yes.
Funds, so we have fun. So
let's end by thanking you all so much.
Thank you all. Thank you.
Thank you.
Enjoyed it.
Thank you, everybody.
Bye.
Bye-bye.